The morning I walked down the aisle near Asheville, 40 chairs sat under the June sun, but only 11 people took a seat. My father was in Atlanta toasting the launch party of my sister instead. I did not cry. I simply got married and memorized every empty chair. 3 weeks later, a single midnight honeymoon photo from a villa overlooking Lake Como resulted in 286 missed calls. My family finally saw the daughter they abandoned. My name is Chloe Stone. I am 31 years old, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. For the past 6 years, I have worked as a senior contract compliance manager at Hawthorne Grid Partners. To anyone outside of the corporate infrastructure sphere, my job title sounds like a dense, impenetrable wall of corporate jargon. In practical terms, it means I am the person who reads the fine print when millions of dollars are on the line. I scour hundreds of pages of vendor agreements, looking for the tiny hidden liabilities in the margins. I find the loopholes before they can calcify into operational disasters. I am disciplined, fiercely private, and exceptionally good at carrying the heavy end of the project without ever demanding a round of applause or a spotlight. It is a career built entirely on anticipating catastrophic failures and quietly neutralizing them before anyone else even notices the threat. If you were to ask my family, assuming they ever bothered to ask about the specifics of my life, they would probably tell you this career makes perfect sense. Mitigating collateral damage and cleaning up messes in the background has been my assigned role in the Stone household since the day I was born. In our family ecosystem, gravity does not pull downward toward the earth. It pulls laterally toward my older sister. Vanessa Stone Mercer is 35 years old, relentlessly glossy, exhaustingly talkative, and utterly addicted to the sensation of being the absolute center of any room she happens to occupy. She does not just enter a space, she claims it as her rightful territory. If Vanessa experiences a mild inconvenience, it is treated as a Greek tragedy worthy of a televised vigil. I remember being 12 years old and twisting my ankle badly during a school track meet. That same afternoon, Vanessa had a minor skin breakout before a high school dance. I sat on the living room sofa with a bag of frozen peas slowly leaking onto my bruised foot, while my mother spent 3 hours doing damage control on Vanessa's chin, whispering soothing affirmations. I did not complain. I knew the rules. This warped dynamic is meticulously upheld by our parents. My mother, Elaine Stone, is a woman entirely consumed by the architecture of the perfect suburban American family image. Her affection is highly conditional, dispensed primarily when one of us provides acceptable material for her carefully curated social narratives. She lives for the annual holiday card, the perfectly staged Thanksgiving dinner photograph, the projection of flawless domestic success. My father, Martin Stone, is a man whose defining characteristic is a profound, paralyzing allergy to conflict. He does not choose the right path. He consistently chooses the path that makes him look okay, while requiring the least amount of friction. If an argument breaks out, my father will suddenly find a reason to check the tire pressure on his sedan. For decades, his easiest strategy to keep the peace has been to placate Vanessa at all costs, which inevitably means sacrificing my needs on the altar of her volatile moods. I was branded early on as the understanding one. Let me tell you, that is a highly dangerous label to assign to a child. Being the understanding one means you are expected to yield unconditionally. It means you must always sympathize with the person stepping on your neck. It means you are the designated emotional landfill, tasked with swallowing your own disappointments whole so that no one else has to look at them. The hierarchy of our family solidified into unyielding concrete the day Vanessa married Owen Mercer. Owen owns a rising, high-end restaurant group based down in Atlanta. He is a man who measures his human worth in restaurant square footage, exclusive reservation wait lists, and the staggering price tags of the luxury watches he casually flashes over expensive appetizers. He did not merely marry my sister, he systematically purchased my parents' absolute loyalty. It was a hostile takeover executed with brutal, smiling efficiency. He offered a few comped tasting menus, made some strategic social introductions that made my mother feel like local Atlanta royalty, and provided a handful of quiet financial interventions. When my parents needed their roof replaced after a bad storm, Owen wrote the check. When they fell behind on property taxes a few years ago, Owen covered the spread. With those calculated gestures, Owen bought his way to the permanent head of the table. In my parents' eyes, Owen is the gold standard, the savior, the successful son they never had. Whatever Owen and Vanessa desire, they receive, because my parents are too intoxicated by their proximity to wealth and far too terrified of losing that financial safety net to ever utter the word no. And then, standing in stark contrast to all of that noise, there is Lucas. I met Lucas Hale 3 years ago. He is 33 years old, a quiet, intensely grounded man who moves through the world without feeling the desperate need to announce his presence. He spent his 20s running ground operations for a portfolio of high-end boutique hotels, absorbing the chaotic, crushing machinery of the hospitality industry from the inside out. Then, one Tuesday morning, he walked away. He quit a secure, highly lucrative corporate trajectory to build a crisis management software platform designed specifically for the service industry. When I finally introduced Lucas to my family, I sat across the table and watched the immediate, collective recalculation in their eyes. To the Stone family, and especially to Owen, Lucas is a textbook failure wrapped up in the polite, modern vocabulary of a tech startup. They look at him and see a man who abandoned a real career to sit in a rented, drafty warehouse space typing lines of code into a laptop. During family dinners, Owen likes to lean back in his chair, sip a glass of expensive bourbon he brought himself, and offer Lucas unsolicited, deeply condescending advice about scalability and profit margins. My father usually stares at his plate during these lectures, while my mother asks thinly veiled, patronizing questions about when Lucas plans to find stable employment and settle down. They use the word entrepreneur like it is a terminal diagnosis. They look at his hands, rough from fixing his own server racks, and they see a man who simply cannot afford to hire a professional. They do not see the sheer brilliance of his logic. They do not see the grueling, unglamorous, 80-hour work weeks he pours into building something monumental from the absolute ground up. But much more importantly, they do not understand what Lucas means to me. Before Lucas walked into my life, my entire existence was a dedicated exercise in shrinking myself. I made my personality small so Vanessa could be large. I asked for absolutely nothing so my parents could feel generous when they tossed me the leftover scraps of their attention. I lived my life in a perpetual state of emotional rationing. Lucas was the first person in my entire life who did not make me fight a bloody battle for the basic right to be seen. Our love did not arrive with dramatic fireworks, nor did it require grand, performative declarations staged for a social media audience. It grew slowly out of the quiet spaces. It was built over late-night takeout boxes in his warehouse office, surrounded by giant whiteboards covered in complex system architecture mapping. It was forged in the absolute calmness of a shared Sunday morning, in the smell of cheap drip coffee, and the steady, rhythmic sound of keyboards clicking in harmony. With Lucas, there was no exhausting performance to maintain. There was no image to uphold. There was only real, tangible work, a profound sense of mutual respect, and the jarring, beautiful realization that I did not have to earn my place beside him by being endlessly useful. I just had to be exactly who I was. While my family measured their worth by the flash of a black credit card and the sheer volume of a demanding voice, Lucas and I were quietly, methodically laying bricks for a real foundation. I did not care that my parents and sister thought he was a foolish dreamer destined for bankruptcy. I did not care that they viewed me as the drab, uninteresting sister who was tragically settling for a man without a corner office. I knew the unshakable truth of our bond. But despite all my sharp observations and corporate discipline, I still carried the naive, stubborn hope that when the time finally came, when I asked for one single day in my entire 31 years to be about me, my family would remember how to love me. I did not yet realize that in a family built entirely on transactional value, the currency of unconditional love had dried up a very long time ago. The rain was falling and heavy. Relentless sheets the night Lucas asked me to marry him. It was a late Tuesday evening in November, and we were sitting inside his rented warehouse loft. The space was a chaotic blend of industrial living and obsessive technological creation. There was no sweeping, cinematic buildup. There were no hidden photographers crouching in the bushes, no carefully curated lighting, and absolutely no audience. The only soundtrack was the rhythmic drumming of water against the massive, drafty windows and the constant, low hum of the cooling fans inside his server racks. We had just finished eating takeout sitting cross-legged on the floor. Lucas pushed his empty carton aside, closed the laptop he had been staring at for the past 6 hours, and looked at me. He did not pull out a velvet box containing a diamond the size of a marble. He reached into his pocket and produced a simple, delicate ring from the 1920s. He later told me he had spent 4 months tracking it down and meticulously restoring the band using the incredibly thin margins of his personal savings. When he asked the question, his voice was steady, utterly devoid of the theatricality that defined every major event in my family. It was just a sincere, grounded request to build a life together. I looked at his tired eyes, at the rough calluses on his hands from building his own hardware infrastructure, and I said yes. My chest felt lighter than it had in 3 decades. Almost immediately, I knew exactly what kind of wedding I wanted. I did not want a sprawling, opulent gala designed to impress strangers. I found a stunning, quiet orchard inn nestled in the foothills just outside of Asheville. The vision was incredibly specific and entirely grounded in warmth. I planned for an intimate guest list of exactly 40 people. We would have an outdoor dinner set at one long wooden table beneath the apple trees, illuminated by simple string lights. The entertainment would be a single acoustic guitar player, and the menu would heavily feature whatever the local farmers were harvesting that week. It was designed to be deeply beautiful without ever straining to fake a level of wealth we did not possess. I wanted the evening to feel like a long, necessary exhale. The illusion that my family might actually share my joy shattered less than a week later. My parents insisted on hosting an engagement dinner at a heavily stylized, aggressively expensive downtown steakhouse. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of aged beef and unspoken judgments. The moment the waiter poured the first glass of wine, Vanessa leaned across the crisp white tablecloth. Her smile was remarkably bright, practically weaponized with fake sweetness. She did not ask how he proposed. She did not ask how I felt. Her very first sentence was a breathless, eager inquiry about our total wedding budget. She delivered the question with a slight tilt of her head, her tone dripping with a preemptive, sickening pity. Before I could even formulate a response to defend the modesty of our plans, my father cleared his throat. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, adopting the painfully polite, deeply condescending voice he normally reserved for service workers who had made a minor error. He looked directly at Lucas and asked when his little software project was going to transition into a real dependable career. My father framed the interrogation as parental concern, but the blade of pure-class prejudice was expertly sharpened just beneath the surface of his words. He suggested, with a patronizing chuckle, that playing startup was a fine hobby for a man in his 20s, but entirely inappropriate for a man preparing to take on a wife. My mother, true to form, ignored the palpable tension radiating from my side of the booth. She was entirely consumed by the logistics of optics. She pulled out her phone and began dictating demands about the guest list. She bluntly informed me that 40 people was an impossibly small number. She insisted that I had to make room for her country club president, 2 local politicians, and a commercial real estate developer I had met exactly 1 time in my entire life. She cared infinitely more about ensuring the room was stocked with the correct demographic of influential acquaintances than she did about what her own daughter actually wanted. I sat there gripping the stem of my wine glass, silently absorbing the familiar, crushing weight of their disrespect. I swallowed the rising anger, falling back into my lifelong habit of being the understanding daughter. I rationalized their behavior in my head, desperately trying to convince myself that they were simply clumsy with their emotions. I told myself that their priorities were completely warped by their environment, but that their fundamental loyalty to me as family was still intact. I foolishly believed that when the actual wedding day arrived, they would put aside their snobbish reservations, sit in those wooden chairs beneath the apple trees, and simply be happy for me. While I was busy deluding myself, Lucas was silently carrying the weight of a massive secret. He was deep into the final, extraordinarily delicate stages of a corporate negotiation with Vale Aurelia Retreats. They were a massive, globally recognized luxury resort conglomerate, and their executive board had taken a sudden, aggressive interest in acquiring his crisis management platform. The entire process was locked behind a brutal, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Lucas did not dare breathe a single word of it to anyone, especially not to my family. He knew exactly how they operated. He knew that if he announced the potential buyout and the deal ultimately collapsed at the last minute, it would forever cement his status as the pathetic, delusional failure they already believed him to be. He refused to hand them the ammunition to destroy his dignity, so he absorbed their condescending remarks at dinner without offering a single word of defense. However, he did not hide the actual work from me. Because the negotiations were moving incredibly fast, he needed an extra set of eyes on the sprawling, highly complex legal documents. Every night, after spending 8 to 10 hours managing vendor compliance and risk mitigation at my own corporate job, I would drive to his loft. I would sit on his worn rug with a cup of black tea, pull out my red pen, and go to work. I brought every ounce of my professional paranoia and contract expertise to his makeshift desk. Night after night, I meticulously combed through pages of dense legal architecture. I reviewed massive clauses dictating liability thresholds, cross-examined the stipulations regarding international customer data privacy, and completely restructured the indemnification protocols to ensure he was fully protected against corporate overreach. I thought I was simply helping him land a standard, albeit large, enterprise licensing agreement. Lucas intentionally kept the equity buyout clauses and the final financial numbers completely separated from the operational risk documents I was reviewing. I had absolutely no idea what I was truly holding in my hands. I did not know that my sharp eye for liability was actively protecting a multi-million-dollar acquisition. I was just a woman exhausted by her family, sitting on a hard floor, pouring my professional skills into the man I loved. I was touching the very contract that was about to permanently alter the financial and social trajectory of our entire lives, completely blind to the fact that I was actively drafting the blueprints for our own liberation. Exactly 21 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my phone rang. It was my Aunt Susan. I was sitting at my kitchen counter, surrounded by seating charts, a spool of silk ribbon, and a stack of unsealed envelopes. I answered on the second ring, expecting a mundane question about dietary restrictions or dress codes. Instead, she hit me with a casual, offhand inquiry that made the air evaporate entirely from my lungs. She asked, in a tone completely devoid of irony or hesitation, how we were all supposed to manage the driving logistics between my ceremony and the grand opening of my sister's new business. I went completely still. The silence stretched so long that she sharply said my name to check if the call had dropped. I asked her to repeat her words slowly. She cheerfully explained that she had just booked her luxury hotel in Atlanta for the House of Mercer launch event, and she wanted to know if I was attending the rooftop reception before or after my own vows. That was how I found out, not from a tearful confession from my sister, not from a delicate, warning phone call from my mother. I found out through a rambling voicemail equivalent delivered by an extended relative who thought she was merely confirming a chaotic family itinerary. My vision blurred at the edges. House of Mercer was a supposed high-end furniture and lifestyle brand my sister had been vaguely hinting at during family dinners for the better part of a year. I immediately set the phone down, opened my laptop, and navigated to my social media applications. There it was, plastered across a meticulously curated, aesthetically flawless grid. An elegant digital invitation announcing a massive, exclusive rooftop launch party in the most expensive district of downtown Atlanta. The date printed in bold. Serif font was the exact date of my wedding. The start time was high noon. The sickening reality washed over me in a wave of cold, heavy nausea. I picked up the phone and dialed Vanessa. She answered on the very first ring, her voice already coated in a thick layer of breathless, manufactured stress. Before I could even finish my first accusatory sentence, she launched into a heavily rehearsed, rapid-fire monologue. She claimed her primary lead investor, an arrogant commercial photographer she simply had to secure for the brand's image, and the management of the highly exclusive rooftop venue were only collectively available on that singular Saturday. She spoke rapidly, painting a picture in which the universe had brutally conspired against her. She framed herself as the helpless, anxious victim of a massive scheduling conflict orchestrated by the cruel hands of fate. It was a masterful, Oscar-worthy performance, but I was a contract compliance manager. My entire professional livelihood depended on establishing concrete timelines, auditing schedules, and uncovering glaring inconsistencies. I did not scream. I did not curse at her. I quietly hung up the phone and opened my personal email archives. I typed her name into the search bar. Within 30 seconds, I found the digital save the date I had sent out exactly 8 months prior. Beneath the automated delivery receipt was a direct, enthusiastic reply from Vanessa herself, confirming she had marked her calendar and booked a styling appointment. She knew. She had known for 240 days. This was not an unfortunate overlapping of corporate events. It was a precise, coldly calculated assassination of my wedding day. She had looked at the calendar, identified the one day out of the entire year that was dedicated solely to my happiness, and deliberately planted her massive, attention-seeking flag right on top of it. The more I dug into the leaked details of the Atlanta event over the next few hours, the clearer her true motive became. The launch party had absolutely nothing to do with actually selling velvet sofas or acquiring legitimate retail buyers. It was a sprawling, aggressively expensive theater production designed entirely for social optics. The vendor list, which a careless event planner had tagged online, included custom floral backdrops costing thousands of dollars, a heavily vetted guest list of local elites, minor regional social media influencers, and a photographer hired specifically to pitch the event gallery to high-end lifestyle magazines. For that kind of aggressive, hollow posturing to work, Vanessa needed a very specific prop. She needed her family standing shoulder to shoulder behind her, filling the frame with smiling, adoring faces to project the image of a deeply rooted, heavily backed legacy brand. A missing family would prompt uncomfortable questions from the investors. A missing family would make the entire endeavor look exactly like what it was, a lonely, desperate vanity project funded entirely by the deep pockets of her wealthy husband. Realizing she needed our parents and every available relative to serve as background extras for her photo shoot, Vanessa executed a divide-and-conquer strategy that was terrifying in its ruthless efficiency. She did not send a blast message to our family group chat. A group setting would have allowed for collective dissent, logical pushback, or a unified realization of what she was doing. Instead, she initiated a series of isolated, highly targeted phone calls. She tailored her emotional manipulation to precisely exploit each person's core psychological weakness. I heard the sickening echoes of these conversations filtering through the family grapevine over the next 48 hours. To our mother, she weaponized pure vanity. She cried softly into the receiver, insisting that the magazine spread would be completely ruined and the brand would look illegitimate if the beautiful matriarch of the family was not standing front and center in the featured press photograph. To the aunts and uncles, she weaponized deep-seated social anxiety. She casually, poisonously mentioned that her husband's wealthy, highly influential family would be arriving in full force. She heavily implied that our side of the family would look poor, unsupportive, and fractured if they chose a rustic orchard gathering over a high society gala. She made it clear that attendance was a test of loyalty to the family's rising status. The most pathetic, stomach-churning display of cowardice, however, came from my father. 2 days after the invitation went public, he called me. His voice was overly hearty, utilizing the fake, booming tone he always adopted whenever he was trying to aggressively gloss over a fundamental failure of character. He cleared his throat loudly, talked about the weather for 2 minutes, and then casually suggested that perhaps the family could simply manage to attend both events. He proposed this absolute absurdity with a straight face, completely ignoring the unforgiving laws of physics, traffic, and geography. Driving from the congested heart of downtown Atlanta to a remote orchard inn tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains takes roughly 4 hours on a perfectly clear day with zero traffic. Adding the time required for a formal rooftop reception, parking logistics in a major city, mingling with investors, and formal wardrobe changes made the idea mathematically and physically impossible. He knew this. He knew that suggesting they could attend a noon gala, stay for photographs, and comfortably make an early evening ceremony hundreds of miles away was a cowardly, transparent lie. He just wanted to magically absolve himself of the crushing guilt of making a definitive choice. He wanted to pretend he was not actively abandoning me for a better photo opportunity. I stood in my kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, and listened to his frantic, illogical rambling about alternative highway routes, speed limits, and early departures. A profound, icy silence settled deep inside my chest. I did not argue with him. I did not point out the geographical impossibilities or the insult to my intelligence. I just let him drown in the pathetic puddle of his own excuses until he finally ran out of breath and awkwardly hung up. The simmering, desperate anger that had defined my relationship with my family throughout my early 20s evaporated entirely. It was replaced by a cold, clinical, hyper-focused clarity. I realized in that moment that begging them to choose me, explaining the hurt, or demanding justice would only validate the power they still held over my emotions. I refused to enter a humiliating bidding war for my own flesh and blood's attendance at my wedding. I picked up my phone and opened the large, dormant text thread containing every single member of my extended family. I did not type a sprawling, emotional paragraph about betrayal. I did not hurl a single accusation or demand tearful explanations. I simply attached a pristine, high-resolution digital image of the final wedding schedule. Below the image, my thumbs moved steadily over the keyboard. I typed out the exact time the acoustic music would begin playing among the trees, the physical address of the Orchard Inn, and the precise hour the harvest dinner would be served. I read over the sterile, purely informative block of text. Then, I added one final, devastatingly calm sentence at the very bottom. I wrote that I hoped to see everyone there. I pressed send, locked the screen, and placed the phone face down on the cool marble counter. It was the definitive drawing of a line in the sand. I was no longer the girl who shrank to fit into their chaotic, self-serving narratives. I had issued the invitation. The empty chairs would be their only answer, and I was finally ready to look at them. The collapse did not happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing bleed. The formal replies began rolling into my inbox like a synchronized chorus of hollow apologies. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and even my godparents systematically erased themselves from my seating chart. Out of the 40 specific places I had carefully curated for my side of the aisle, the rejections piled up with terrifying speed. They all cited incredibly vague, excessively polite conflicts. Some claimed sudden travel complications. Others blamed unavoidable work obligations. But beneath the thin veneer of etiquette, every single compass needle pointed directly to a rooftop in downtown Atlanta. My entire bloodline was abandoning ship, fleeing toward the blinding spotlight of my sister's vanity project. I probably would have spent the rest of my life trying to gracefully rationalize their absence, clinging to the pathetic belief that they were simply mesmerized by a flashy venue. I would have lived in that delusion if it had not been for Tessa Brooks. Tessa is my closest friend, a hardened charge nurse who runs a chaotic emergency room trauma unit. She speaks with the unforgiving precision of a surgical blade and possesses absolutely zero tolerance for suburban melodrama. Several years ago, during some chaotic holiday planning phase, an oblivious relative had added Tessa to the sprawling, extended Stone family group chat. Because Tessa never actively sent messages, my family had completely forgotten she was quietly lurking in the digital background, observing their every move. Exactly 2 weeks before the ceremony, Tessa drove straight to my house after completing a grueling 12-hour night shift. She did not bother knocking. She pushed open my front door, dropped her heavy canvas hospital bag onto the hardwood floor, and marched directly into my kitchen. Without saying a single word, she shoved her phone into my hand. The screen was glowing with an extensive gallery of saved screenshots. She had meticulously captured days of unchecked, unfiltered family discussions. I stood perfectly still, scrolling through the digital evidence. The sheer, casual cruelty of their conversation was breathtaking. Vanessa had completely commandeered the narrative in the chat, answering logistical questions from confused elderly aunts. I read the exact, devastating sentence where my own sister described my upcoming ceremony as a small, rustic, and pathetic little gathering that was guaranteed to look hopelessly poor next to her corporate launch. She typed those vicious words out and pressed send to our own flesh and blood, knowing nobody would defend me. My thumb trembled slightly over the glass screen as I kept scrolling. Then, I found the message that finally, permanently severed the frayed rope tying me to my family. One of my uncles had weakly typed out a suggestion that perhaps skipping a wedding entirely was a bit harsh. Vanessa's reply was instantaneous, defensive, and dripping with venomous entitlement. She commanded everyone to stop overreacting, stating bluntly that I was already perfectly used to standing behind her anyway. It was not merely an observation, it was a deeply ingrained family directive. In her mind, my entire existence was nothing more than a supporting role, a designated, permanent shadow created solely to ensure her light always appeared brighter. I was not a sister. I was a prop meant to stay in the background. But Tessa's screenshots revealed an even darker, much more terrifying reality than my sister's raging narcissism. Tessa pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a separate, hushed exchange between my mother and an aunt. This exchange had accidentally spilled into the main thread before my mother frantically deleted it. But she was not fast enough. Tessa had caught it. In those frantic, digitally captured messages, my mother confessed the actual, terrifying reason my parents could not simply tell Owen and Vanessa no. It was no longer just about the free luxury dinners or the desperate social climbing. It was about pure, unadulterated survival. Over the past 18 months, Owen's aggressive restaurant expansion into a neighboring state had failed spectacularly. His business was hemorrhaging cash. To patch his bleeding accounts and save his fragile, arrogant ego, my parents had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on their own home. They had handed him the capital to keep his sinking ship afloat. The perfect, glossy paint of the Stone family was peeling off in jagged, ugly strips right in front of my eyes. My parents were not merely choosing the flashy favorite daughter. They were terrified, desperate hostages. Their unwavering loyalty was heavily shackled to a massive, looming bank loan. If they upset Owen, if they refused to be the smiling, the compliant background props for Vanessa's fake brand launch, they risked a catastrophic financial explosion that would leave them homeless and bankrupt in their late 60s. They were willingly sacrificing their youngest daughter at the altar of their own financial ruin. The betrayal was so profoundly cowardly, so deeply pathetic, that it completely transcended anger. It settled into my bones as a cold, clinical, permanent disgust. When Lucas came home later that night, I handed him the phone. I watched him read every single word in absolute chilling silence. His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing dangerously beneath his skin. He gently took the device from my hands, placed it face down on the coffee table, and pulled me tightly against his chest. He did not offer empty, useless platitudes about how things would eventually get better. Instead, his voice low and firm, he proposed that we burn the entire plan to the ground. He begged me to cancel the caterer, cancel the musicians, and walk away from the Orchard Inn. He wanted to drive me to the county courthouse the very next morning, sign the legal marriage documents in a completely empty, sterile room, and elope. He desperately wanted to spare me the agonizing, public humiliation of standing before dozens of empty chairs. He wanted to shield me from the physical, undeniable manifestation of their complete abandonment. I pressed my face against his shoulder, letting the sheer exhaustion wash over me, but I slowly shook my head. I told him no. I had spent 31 years averting my eyes. softening the brutal blows, and pretending the ugly, rotting parts of my family were just simple misunderstandings. I was officially done looking away. I wanted to stand in that orchard. I wanted to see the exact shape, size, and depth of their absence. I needed to look the brutal truth directly in the eye, without any softening filters, without any pathetic excuses, so I could finally carve them out of my heart with a crystal clear conscience. I needed to witness those empty chairs so I would never, ever be tempted to invite them back into my life again. I needed the finality of it. It was the late evening, just hours before the wedding. We were packing our overnight bags in the quiet sanctuary of his loft, while I was carefully folding my dress into a garment bag. Lucas's laptop chimed with a high priority, encrypted notification. I saw him glance sharply at the glowing screen. It was an email from the executive board of Vale Aurelia Retreats. It was the absolute, final confirmation of the corporate buyout. The multi-million-dollar acquisition of his software platform was officially locked in, legally funded, and preparing for public announcement. He could have told me right then. He could have used that staggering, life-altering financial victory to cushion the devastating emotional blow I was going to take the next morning. But as he quietly closed his laptop, he made a silent, deeply protective decision to keep it buried for just a little while longer. He looked at me, his eyes dark and resolute. He knew with absolute certainty that if he revealed the money now, the news would inevitably leak. And if my family somehow caught the scent of that kind of immense, earth-shattering wealth, they would instantly abandon the rooftop party in Atlanta and flock to the Orchard Inn like vultures. Lucas refused to let their presence be purchased. He wanted to know exactly who was willing to show up for us when we were supposedly just a quiet compliance manager and a failing tech entrepreneur. He was letting the trap snap completely shut. The morning of my wedding did not begin with the joyful chaos usually promised by bridal magazines. It began with the harsh, vibrating hum of my cell phone against the wooden nightstand at exactly 7 o'clock. The sun was just barely cresting over the mountains, casting long, pale beams of light across the hardwood floor of my suite. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold glass of the screen. My father's name was illuminated in bright white letters. I accepted the call. I did not say hello. I just waited. The line was filled with a heavy, suffocating static before my father finally cleared his throat. His voice was uncharacteristically thin, stripped of its usual booming, artificial confidence. He did not offer a greeting. He bypassed any pretense of warmth and immediately launched into a disjointed, cowardly explanation. He told me that he could not make the drive. He stammered through a pathetic excuse about the scheduling logistics becoming too complicated, but then, unable to help himself, he revealed the brutal, honest truth. He said Vanessa needed enough family in the opening frame of the promotional video. He literally used the word frame. In his mind, my wedding was not a milestone of his child's life. It was a conflicting production schedule, and he had been cast as a background extra in a more lucrative movie. He muttered something about not wanting to make things more messy, as if his absence was a noble sacrifice for the greater good of the family peace. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg him to reconsider. I simply told him I understood, and I ended the call. Less than 10 minutes later, a text message arrived. It was from my mother. It was not an apology for my father's sudden withdrawal. It was a preemptive strike, a demand for my absolute compliance. The message read that I needed to be the understanding daughter today. She typed out the justification with chilling clarity. She wrote that my sister's brand only had one first launch day. I stared at those words until the letters blurred together. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the statement paralyzed me. A woman who had been married for nearly 4 decades was actively telling her daughter that a fake corporate rooftop party held more singular importance than the vows of marriage. It was a statement so cold, so profoundly detached from any recognizable maternal instinct, that it left me completely devoid of arguments. You cannot debate with a person who lacks a fundamental emotional baseline. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the preparations were complete. Tessa helped me step into my dress. It was simple, elegant, and perfectly tailored, free of the excessive lace and heavy beadwork my mother had tried to force upon me months ago. When I finally walked out onto the stone patio overlooking the ceremony space, the physical reality of my family's betrayal hit me with the force of a physical blow. The Orchard Inn was breathtaking. The apple trees provided a lush, vibrant canopy against the cloudless June sky, but beneath those trees sat the chairs. There were exactly 40 wooden chairs, arranged with meticulous geometric precision by the venue staff. I stood there, my hands gripping the fabric of my skirt, and I looked at them. 29 chairs were completely empty. The afternoon sun beat down on the bare, polished wood. They were beautiful, terrible monuments. Every single empty seat was a loud, undeniable statement of rejection, lined up neatly row by row. They represented every aunt, every uncle, every cousin, and the two parents who had decided that a free glass of champagne in Atlanta was worth more than my presence in their lives. The sight was painful, a searing ache in the center of my chest, but I refused to look away. I needed to memorize the exact shape of this abandonment. The acoustic guitarist began to play the slow, gentle melody we had chosen. It was time. Tessa squeezed my hand and began her walk down the short aisle, leaving me alone at the starting point. I was supposed to have my father beside me. I was supposed to have a steady arm to lean on. Instead, I had the quiet rustle of the wind and the glaring empty spaces. I took a deep breath, preparing to take the first step entirely on my own. That was when Margot Bell appeared. Margot was 62 years old. She was a widow, the owner of the inn, and a woman who carried an aura of quiet, unshakable strength. Over the past 8 months, she had watched me sit in her lobby for countless hours, drafting seating charts, arranging floral deliveries, and managing every tiny logistical detail of this day without a single family member present to assist me. She knew the entire story without me ever having to speak a word of it. Margot stepped up to my left side. She was wearing a tailored navy suit, her silver hair pulled back flawlessly. She did not offer me a look of pity. Pity would have broken me. Instead, she offered her arm. Her voice was low, steady, and commanded absolute authority. She looked straight ahead at the altar and said that no bride starts her wedding day feeling abandoned right in the middle of her house. It was a stunning, breathtaking act of grace. Margot was not stepping in to be a poor substitute for my father. She was a complete stranger who had decided to actively choose kindness at the precise second my own bloodline had chosen cruelty. I slipped my arm through hers, anchored by her solid presence, and together we began to walk. The ceremony was incredibly short, profoundly beautiful, and stripped of all the pretentious, artificial theater that usually accompanied a Stone family event. As I walked down the aisle, I locked eyes with Lucas. He stood under the wooden archway, his dark suit perfectly framing his broad shoulders. He did not let his gaze drift toward the 29 empty chairs. He looked at me with an intensity and a devotion so complete that it felt as though the entire valley was filled with thousands of cheering people. When he spoke his vows, his voice was a deep, resonant promise of absolute safety. We exchanged our rings in front of the 11 guests who had chosen to stay. Those 11 people my closest friends. His trusted colleagues did not look around nervously. They sat close, their smiles genuine, their presence forming a warm, impenetrable fortress around us. The harvest dinner that evening was supposed to be a triumph. The long wooden table was illuminated by dozens of soft candles and strands of glowing bulbs woven through the branches above. The food was incredible, the wine flowed freely, and the laughter was genuine. But the lingering venom of my past life was not entirely flushed from my system. Sometime after the main course, I excused myself to the bridal suite to adjust my hair. The room was quiet. My bag sat on the dresser. Out of sheer, destructive habit, a lingering compulsion to check the pulse of the family that had discarded me, I picked up my phone. I opened my social media feed. The algorithm, cruel and efficient, immediately served me the newest update from Vanessa. It was a short video clip. I tapped the screen, and the serene quiet of my bridal suite was instantly shattered by the loud, thumping bass of a nightclub track. The video panned across a blindingly bright rooftop. The skyline of Atlanta gleamed in the background, and there they were. My mother was wearing a heavily sequined dress, holding up a glass of expensive champagne and laughing with her head thrown back. My father was beside her, looking flushed and eager as he shook hands with a local influencer. The camera swept past my aunts and cousins, all clustered around a massive, absurd floral display bearing the launch logo. But it was the text overlay that finally severed the last, pathetic thread of my attachment. Vanessa had stamped 2 words across the bottom of the video in bold, stylized letters: "Family first." It was a public execution. It was a gleeful, broadcasted slap across the face. She was using the very concept of family as a weapon, flaunting their unity on the exact day they had all conspired to leave me completely alone. They were raising their glasses to an empty brand while my 29 empty chairs sat in the dark just a few hours away. I did not throw the phone. I did not collapse onto the floor in a fit of hysterical tears. The well of grief I had maintained for these people had finally, permanently run dry. I felt a strange, icy calmness wash over me. I closed the application, locked the screen, and placed the device back into my bag. I walked out of that room, leaving the ghosts of my past behind in the digital ether. Late that night, long after the 11 guests had departed and the candles had burned down to the wood, Lucas and I lay side by side in the massive bed of our suite. The moonlight spilled across the heavy quilt. The silence in the room was absolute. There were no incoming messages. There were no missed calls. Not a single person from that rooftop had bothered to take 30 seconds out of their evening to send a text wishing me well. The silence was their final gift to me. Lucas reached across the sheets, finding my hand in the dark. His fingers laced through mine, his thumb gently tracing the metal of my new wedding band. We did not need to discuss the silence. We both understood exactly what it meant. We lay there, breathing together, and for the first time in my entire 31 years of life, I felt the crushing weight of expectation completely lift off my chest. I finally understood what it meant to cut the cord. I was no longer a supporting character begging for scraps of affection in a family that only valued currency and applause. From this night forward, we would build our own world, and we would never again stand in a posture of waiting to be chosen. 7 full days passed without a single sound from my bloodline. 168 hours of absolute, unbroken silence. My phone remained entirely devoid of messages from my parents or my sister. There were no delayed apologies, no awkward attempts to bridge the massive chasm they had ripped open, and certainly no inquiries about how I was feeling. They had chosen their side, and they were firmly entrenched in the glittering, hollow reality they had built in Atlanta. But the profound quiet they left behind in my life did not feel like a punishment. It felt like a massive, sterile, clean room where I could finally breathe without inhaling their toxic exhaust. On the evening of the 7th day, Lucas and I were sitting in the living room of our apartment. He had been working quietly at the dining table for hours. Suddenly, he closed his laptop with a definitive snap, walked over to the sofa, and asked me to sit down. The air in the room shifted immediately. He did not have the exhausted, stressed demeanor of a man grinding through another endless startup obstacle. He looked remarkably still, grounded by an invisible, massive anchor. He poured 2 cups of black coffee, handed one to me, and proceeded to dismantle the reality I thought I knew. He calmly explained that the brutal, secretive negotiations he had been navigating for months were officially over. Val Aurelia Retreats had not just licensed his software, they had executed a massive, aggressive buyout of his entire crisis management platform. The conglomerate had purchased a majority stake, completely absorbing the technology he had spent the last 3 grueling years building in a drafty warehouse. But they did not just want his code. They demanded his continuous strategic vision. As part of the acquisition, they had appointed him as a partner and the official director of guest recovery strategy for their entire global portfolio. The financial numbers he quietly laid out between us were staggering. It was not just a comfortable safety net, it was generational wealth. It was a sum of money so large and definitive that it permanently eradicated the concept of living month to month. Our financial position had changed literally overnight. I sat frozen, holding my coffee mug, trying to process the magnitude of the shift. But before I could even formulate a coherent sentence, Lucas raised his hand to stop me. He told me the money was not the most important part of the conversation. He reached into a leather folder and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper. It was an internal memorandum from the chief legal counsel of Vale Aurelia. Lucas slid the paper across the coffee table toward me. He instructed me to read the second paragraph. The memorandum explicitly highlighted the final stage of contract reviews. The corporate lawyers specifically praised the airtight, incredibly aggressive revisions made to the indemnification structures and the international data liability clauses. The legal counsel noted that whoever had redlined those specific sections had successfully shielded the acquisition from three massive, potentially catastrophic legal risks that the original draft had left wide open. Lucas looked directly into my eyes and told me those were my red lines. The late-night edits I had made while sitting on his worn rug, exhausted from my own corporate job, were the exact revisions the memorandum was praising. I stared at the paper, my vision blurring slightly. For my entire life, my family had treated my career in contract compliance as a painfully dull, unremarkable clerical duty. They viewed me as a glorified administrative assistant, while they worshipped Owen's loud, flashy restaurant empire. Yet, here was concrete, undeniable proof that my sharp, disciplined mind had actively secured our future. I was not merely a passive wife standing faithfully beside a successful man. I had unknowingly co-piloted the defining transaction of his life. My professional expertise had built the legal armor that protected his life's work and sealed the deal. I looked up at him, my voice trembling slightly as I asked why he had kept this a secret. If the deal was finalized, why did he let me walk into our wedding day believing we were still fighting from the bottom? His expression darkened, filled with a fierce, unwavering protective instinct. He confessed that the final, binding signatures were executed the night before our ceremony. He deliberately chose to swallow the news because he needed to see the unvarnished truth. He needed to know exactly what my parents and my sister would choose to do when there was absolutely no scent of money or power in the air to influence their actions. He knew with chilling certainty that if he had announced a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout, my parents would have instantly abandoned Vanessa's rooftop party. They would have sprinted to the Orchard Inn, faking tears of joy and claiming they had always supported us. He refused to let them contaminate our vows with their calculated, sickening greed. He let the trap snap shut, so I could finally see them for exactly who they were. Then, his face softened, and the heavy atmosphere in the room cracked open, letting the light pour in. He pulled one final envelope from his folder. The executive board at Vale Aurelia had somehow learned about the bitter, painful circumstances surrounding our wedding week. They knew we had completely scrapped our modest honeymoon plans to manage the emotional fallout of my family's abandonment. As a welcome gesture to their new partner, and a quiet nod of respect to the woman who had fortified their contract, the founders of the conglomerate offered us a gift. They invited us to spend 2 uninterrupted weeks at Castello Bellaforte. It was their private, fiercely guarded stone villa situated directly on the shores of Lake Como. My immediate, knee-jerk reaction was a sharp instinct to refuse the offer. My entire psychological framework had been conditioned by my family to view sudden, extreme luxury as a dangerous trap. In the Stone family, wealth was never a pure gift. It was always a heavy chain. Owen used his money to buy submission, to dictate terms, and to force people to shrink themselves. I was terrified that accepting a trip to a private Italian estate would make our lives feel glossy and fake. I did not want to become the kind of person who defined their worth by their proximity to opulence. But as I looked at the heavy, embossed invitation, a profound realization washed over me. This was not a bribe. This was not a wealthy man attempting to purchase my loyalty or forcing me to act as a smiling prop in a fake social media photograph. This was a genuine invitation from a world that valued actual competence, hard work, and quiet brilliance. For the very first time in my 31 years, I was being welcomed into a beautiful, elevated space strictly because we had earned the right to be there. I did not have to shrink my personality, bite my tongue, or beg for permission to walk through this door. I looked at Lucas, felt the solid, undeniable truth of our partnership, and told him we were going to Italy. While we were quietly renewing our passports and packing our luggage, the carefully constructed facade back in Atlanta was beginning to violently fracture. The hospitality industry is surprisingly small, and corporate gossip travels with lethal, unforgiving speed. Through my own network of compliance managers and vendors, the truth about Vanessa's grand launch party started bleeding out into the open. The rooftop gala had successfully generated hundreds of beautiful photographs and glowing social media posts, but it had yielded absolutely zero wholesale orders. House of Mercer had no actual distribution deals. Her expensive inventory was sitting stagnant, gathering dust in a rented warehouse. The entire brand was a hollow shell, but the situation with Owen was infinitely worse. His aggressive expansion strategy had completely imploded behind the curtain of his expensive public relations. A vendor I worked closely with casually mentioned over a conference call that Owen's restaurant group was actively defaulting on their supply chain payments. The empire was hemorrhaging cash. He was drowning in debt, desperately trying to keep the lights on while maintaining his arrogant public persona. The dazzling wealthy kingdom my parents had worshipped, the very empire they had secretly mortgaged their own home to protect, was collapsing in real time. They had abandoned me at the altar, choosing what they believed was the winning side, entirely blind to the fact that they had tied their survival to a sinking ship. Meanwhile, Lucas and I were quietly stepping onto a private boat, heading toward the mountains, completely free. The journey from the local airport was a seamless transition into a reality I still struggled to comprehend. A private, polished wooden boat waited for us at the dock, its motor humming a low, steady rhythm as it sliced through the impossibly deep blue waters of Lake Como. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of jasmine and cold fresh water. As we rounded a bend surrounded by steep, lush mountainsides, Castello Bellaforte came into view. It was a staggering marvel of historic architecture, a massive stone villa clinging elegantly to the edge of the water. When we were escorted to our suite, I walked straight past the enormous, opulent bed and opened the heavy glass doors. Our bedroom extended out onto a sweeping stone balcony. The late afternoon sunlight poured over the iron railings, coating the ancient stone floor in a thick, warm glow that looked exactly like liquid honey. I stood at the edge of that balcony, gripping the warm iron, and let out a breath I felt I had been holding for 3 decades. The sheer, overwhelming beauty of the estate was undeniable, but the luxury was not what caused the tight knot in my chest to finally unravel. What moved me to the point of tears was the absolute, profound silence. There was no chaotic clamoring for attention. There was no need to shrink my posture, lower my voice, or carefully monitor the mood of the room. For the very first time in my adult life, I was standing in a breathtaking space where no one was demanding that I fight for my rightful place in a family photograph. The peace was absolute. I was simply allowed to exist, fully and completely, without having to serve as the dull background scenery for someone else's glittering performance. Of course, I knew exactly what this specific villa represented to the people I had left behind. During one of our agonizingly long family dinners back in North Carolina, Vanessa had shoved her tablet into my face to show off the visual inspiration for her supposedly elite lifestyle brand. She had spent hours curating an aesthetic mood board meant to project old-world wealth and unattainable European luxury. Pinned directly in the center of that digital collage was a highly stylized, professional photograph of Castello Bellaforte. She had obsessed over its iconic stone arches and the sweeping panoramic view of the lake. She had claimed it was the ultimate standard of high society living. Because of that, I knew with absolute, chilling certainty that if I posted even a fraction of that view, My sister would recognize the architecture instantly. It was the architectural holy grail of her fake, manufactured universe. I waited until the evening of our third night. We had just returned from a quiet dinner down in the village. The sky had bruised into a deep, vibrant purple, and the lights from the distant towns were reflecting perfectly on the glassy surface of the lake. I asked Lucas to stand beside me against the balcony railing. I did not stage a flashy, obnoxious photo shoot. There were no designer shopping bags strategically placed in the background, no close-ups of expensive watches, and absolutely zero corporate logos. It was just a simple, unedited photograph of a husband and a wife standing together in front of one of the most exclusive, recognizable vistas in northern Italy. I opened my social media application, selected the image, and typed out a caption consisting of exactly 8 words: Honeymoon. Grateful for the people who showed up. I hit publish, turned my phone completely off, and went to sleep in the arms of the man who had actually chosen me. The peaceful Italian morning was violently shattered the moment I powered my device back on. The screen instantly froze, choked by a massive, aggressive tidal wave of notifications. The phone vibrated continuously in my palm like a dying insect. By the time the screen finally caught up with the incoming data, I was staring at a staggering 286 missed calls and text messages. The very same people who had maintained an absolute graveyard silence on the most important day of my life were suddenly frantic, desperate to breach my digital perimeter. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. My family had finally seen the exact daughter they had so casually abandoned, and the realization was driving them absolutely insane. I opened my father's messages first. His texts were frantic, completely devoid of his usual manufactured polite detachment. He demanded to know whose estate we were staying in. His follow-up message was a thinly veiled accusation, asking why I had never bothered to mention that Lucas was doing so remarkably well for himself. The sheer, transparent greed of his words made my stomach turn. He did not care about my happiness. He was just furiously calculating the missed financial opportunities. My mother's approach was equally nauseating, but coated in a thick fake layer of maternal warmth. She bypassed any acknowledgement of her absence at the altar and aggressively insisted that we simply must host a massive, extended family celebration dinner the very second we returned stateside. She wanted to claim her front-row seat to our newly discovered status, but the true, unhinged masterpiece of the morning was the sequence of messages from Vanessa. She had fired off 3 consecutive texts in rapid succession, documenting a spectacular psychological spiral. The first message was pure, unfiltered shock. She typed in all capital letters, demanding to know how on earth I had managed to secure access to the Castello. The second text arrived 10 minutes later, shifting into a frantic, jealous interrogation about who was paying for the trip and what kind of illicit connections Lucas had used to bypass the legendary waiting list. Finally, a full hour later, after the reality of her own failing brand had likely settled back into her bones, came the third message. It was a deeply patronizing, manipulative suggestion that the two of us needed to sit down and talk things out exactly like mature adults. She was desperately trying to assert dominance, completely oblivious to the fact that she had lost every ounce of leverage she ever possessed. Yet, the most spectacular, mouth-drying piece of irony did not even come to my phone. Lucas walked out onto the balcony, holding 2 cups of espresso, a dark, dangerous smirk playing on his lips. He turned his screen toward me. It was a direct private message from Owen, the arrogant restaurant mogul, the man who had spent 3 years openly mocking my husband's career, the man who had casually referred to the tech platform as a pathetic service industry pipe dream, was suddenly groveling. Owen had somehow connected the dots between our location and the corporate footprint of Vale Aurelia Retreats. His message was a pathetic, transparent plea. He was begging Lucas for a direct, high-level introduction to the food and beverage acquisition department of the conglomerate. His own empire was bleeding out, and he was desperately trying to crawl his way into the very corporate ecosystem he had spent years laughing at. The alarm bells of their collective panic were ringing at a deafening volume, and I sat there, sipping my hot espresso, enjoying the glorious, uninterrupted sound of their desperation. I consumed the incoming flood of text messages with the cold, clinical detachment of a medical examiner reviewing a highly detailed autopsy report. Each digital notification popping up on my screen was a precise, undeniable cross-section of human hypocrisy. The very same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had manufactured flimsy, transparent excuses to avoid sitting in the orchard on my wedding day were suddenly composing lengthy essays about how they had always believed in our potential. An aunt who had explicitly cited a non-existent, sudden severe migraine to justify skipping my ceremony now claimed she always knew Lucas possessed a brilliant, visionary mind. A cousin who had ignored my wedding invitation entirely sent a sprawling paragraph claiming we were the most inspiring couple in the family. It was an absolute masterclass in retrospective loyalty. This sudden wave of affection was entirely fabricated the exact moment they smelled the distinct, heavy scent of real capital radiating from the photographs of the Italian villa. They were desperately trying to rewrite history, actively painting themselves as our silent, unwavering champions rather than the opportunistic cowards who had left 29 wooden chairs completely empty under the harsh summer sun. I refused to engage in a prolonged, emotional negotiation with their sudden bout of amnesia. I opened the main extended family group chat, the exact same digital space where they had previously coordinated their mass defection to Atlanta, and I typed a single, definitive response. I wrote that Lucas and I were perfectly fine, healthy, and enjoying our time away. I then stated, with absolute, unwavering clarity, that their coordinated absence on my wedding day was a concrete reality. The resulting pain of that abandonment was a documented fact, and I required a significant, indefinite amount of physical and emotional distance from every single one of them. I hit send. I did not wait to watch the inevitable flurry of defensive, frantic replies. I permanently muted the conversation thread and set the phone face down on the cold marble table. Less than 1 week after we returned stateside, the massive corporate machinery of the hospitality industry finally moved our reality into the public light. A major, highly respected international trade publication dropped the exclusive story on a Tuesday morning. The bold headline officially announced the multi-million-dollar acquisition of a revolutionary crisis management platform by Vale Aurelia Retreats. The lengthy article featured a high-resolution, professional photograph of Lucas, formally introducing him under his new, incredibly heavy corporate title as Partner and Director of Guest Recovery Strategy. The financial press treated the transaction as the most significant tech buyout of the entire business quarter. But the specific detail that truly shifted the tectonic plates beneath my family was buried deep inside a secondary, highly circulated internal newsletter distributed to the global vendor network of Vale Aurelia. A desperate corporate contact of Owen must have forwarded the document directly to him, because the information reached my parents almost instantaneously. In a dedicated paragraph discussing the aggressive, complex timeline of the acquisition, the chief legal officer of the conglomerate publicly credited me by my full name. The brief, formal statement praised my exceptional, ruthless restructuring of their international compliance architecture during the final, critical phase of the buyout. It was a seemingly minor corporate acknowledgement to the outside world, but in the suffocating context of the Stone family dynamic, it was a nuclear detonation. I was no longer the quiet, unremarkable daughter pushing boring papers in a gray cubicle. The luxury hospitality industry had just publicly verified that I was a formidable, highly skilled architect standing directly at the center of a massive financial transaction. While my sudden elevation was being broadcasted across elite professional networks, the flimsy, glittering stage my sister had built in downtown Atlanta was systematically collapsing into dust. The reality of retail operations is utterly unforgiving, and no amount of expensive aesthetic curation can permanently mask a fundamentally broken supply chain. The brutal truth about House of Mercer began leaking out through furious customer reviews and vicious industry gossip. Her heavily promoted brand possessed absolutely zero solid sales infrastructure. She had spent hundreds of thousands of borrowed dollars on a lavish rooftop launch party, but had completely failed to secure reliable manufacturing or distribution channels. Customers who had placed premium orders online were experiencing aggressive delays stretching past 60 days. The few overpriced items that did miraculously ship were being returned at an alarming rate due to catastrophic quality control issues. The final, fatal blow to her hollow vanity project arrived when her primary target investor abruptly severed all ties. The wealthy venture capitalist, the very man Vanessa had desperately needed to impress by forcing our entire family to stand behind her as smiling props on that rooftop, initiated a deep forensic dive into her back-end analytics. The moment his financial team discovered that her actual revenue numbers were practically non-existent compared to her heavily inflated social media metrics, he pulled his lucrative term sheet off the table entirely. The brand was brutally exposed as a hemorrhaging illusion. Simultaneously, the financial rot eating away at the foundation of Owen's restaurant empire reached a critical, undeniable tipping point. The third-quarter financial reports revealed disastrous, negative profit margins across his entire dining portfolio. His aggressive, arrogant, and poorly calculated expansion into neighboring commercial markets had drained his operational cash reserves completely dry. Within weeks, his corporate entity officially violated the strict liquidity covenants of their primary commercial bank loans. The institutional lenders immediately initiated hostile, unforgiving collection protocols. This catastrophic business failure did not merely threaten Owen's luxury car leases or his expensive, exclusive country club memberships. Because my parents had secretly and foolishly taken out a massive second mortgage on their own suburban home to inject emergency cash into his failing enterprise. The bank's crosshairs shifted directly onto them. The heavy, terrifying legal notices began arriving in their mailbox via certified mail. The very house I had grown up in, the physical fortress of my mother's carefully curated suburban image, was suddenly dragged right to the absolute edge of foreclosure. Their desperate, pathetic gamble to buy the lasting affection of a wealthy son-in-law had backfired with lethal precision. Predictably, the shifting financial winds triggered a sickening, rapid change in their behavior toward me. My phone, which had been blissfully quiet after my final boundary-setting message from Italy, suddenly became a relentless battleground of saccharine affection. The invitations started pouring in with an aggressive, suffocating frequency. My mother left voicemails in a trembling, fragile tone, claiming she missed her youngest daughter terribly and simply wanted to cook my favorite childhood dinner so we could reconnect. My father sent perfectly punctuated, highly manipulative text messages suggesting we all get together at a nice steakhouse to clear the air and move forward as a united family front. Vanessa even attempted to mail a thick, handwritten card to my corporate office, heavily implying that sisterhood was an unbreakable bond far stronger than any temporary misunderstanding. If this massive influx of attention had happened exactly 5 years ago, my desperate, younger self might have actually believed their lies. I might have foolishly interpreted their sudden desire for proximity as genuine remorse or a profound, miraculous awakening of unconditional parental love. But standing firmly on the other side of that empty wedding aisle, fully equipped with the cold, hard, undeniable facts of their impending financial ruin, their motives were completely transparent. They were not reaching out because they suddenly recognized my inherent value as a human being. They were not calling because they felt a crushing, sleepless guilt over leaving me entirely alone on the most important day of my life. They were circling back because they could smell the distinct, undeniable scent of a massive rescue boat. They saw the trade publications. They understood the sheer magnitude of the Vale Aurelia acquisition. They knew Lucas and I were now standing safely on a massive fortress of capital, and they were actively drowning in a dark, suffocating swamp of debt. Every sudden declaration of familial love, every tearful voicemail, and every polite invitation to clear the air was nothing more than a calculated, desperate attempt to secure a new line of credit. They had finally turned around to look at me, but they were only looking at me because I was now holding the one single thing they worshipped above all else. They desperately wanted our money, and they were fully prepared to fake an entire loving relationship just to get their hands on it. My father was the very first person to physically breach the silent perimeter I had established around my life. He arrived at my front door on a damp Tuesday evening. He did not call ahead. He did not bring a peace offering. There was no bouquet of grocery store flowers, no carefully selected bottle of wine to soften the blow of his presence. He simply stood on my porch, wearing the deeply unsettled, hollow expression of a man who was finally staring directly at the catastrophic consequences of his own lifelong cowardice. I unlatched the deadbolt and let him step into the foyer, but I intentionally did not offer him a seat in the living room, nor did I offer him a glass of water. We stood facing each other under the harsh, unforgiving glow of the overhead entryway light. He offered an apology, but it was a pathetic, deformed thing. It lacked the heavy, grounding weight of true accountability. Instead, his words were hopelessly entangled with his creeping, suffocating terror of losing his suburban home. He spoke in rapid, nervous circles about the bank notices arriving by certified mail. He rubbed his hands together, his eyes darting around my pristine hallway, and then, almost predictably, he dropped the true purpose of his visit right onto the hardwood floor. He cleared his throat, adopting a weak approximation of his old authoritative tone, and suggested that surely Lucas, with his new corporate leverage and deep industry connections, could probably open a few strategic doors to help his brother-in-law out of a temporary financial bind. I looked at him, truly seeing him not as my imposing father, but as a weak, terrified man desperately trying to use me as a human shield. He expected the old, compliant daughter to simply nod, swallow her anger, and fix the mess to restore the fragile family peace. I did not raise my voice. I looked directly into his shifting eyes and told him his apology was categorically rejected. I opened the front door, asked him to leave, and locked the deadbolt the second he stepped back out into the humid night air. The very next morning, my mother executed her own desperate offensive. She did not bother driving across town to face me in person. She called me from the safety of her heavily mortgaged kitchen. The moment I answered the phone, she bypassed any normal, polite greeting and launched straight into a theatrical, sobbing monologue. She cried about the terrible, crushing financial situation they were suddenly facing. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of their impending ruin, describing sleepless nights and panic attacks. However, her tears were entirely self-serving. She never once mentioned my empty wedding aisle. Then, she delivered a line so breathtakingly manipulative it momentarily paralyzed my vocal cords. She told me I needed to stop being so stubborn, begging me not to let things go too far. She actually possessed the sheer audacity to frame my silent boundary as the active, malicious force destroying our family. In her warped, completely inverted reality, the fact that I was refusing to hand over my husband's newly acquired capital to save her sinking ship made me the villain. I was suddenly the cruel executioner pushing them over the financial cliff. This narrative completely absolved her of the undeniable fact that she had willingly mortgaged her own future to buy a front-row seat to a fake rooftop party, actively choosing a wealthy son-in-law over her own daughter. I felt the familiar urge to argue, to logically dismantle her delusion, but I stopped myself. You cannot reason with a person committed to misunderstanding you. I calmly told her that the severe consequences she was currently experiencing were entirely self-authored, and I firmly disconnected the call. Vanessa took a completely different, highly calculated approach. She orchestrated a meeting at an aggressively chic, notoriously overpriced coffee shop situated in the most expensive commercial district of the city. I agreed to go. I did not agree because I harbored any lingering, foolish hope for a tearful reconciliation, but because I wanted to look her directly in the eye and watch her play her final, desperate hand. When I arrived, she was already seated at a corner marble table, attempting to project an aura of casual, untouchable elegance. She started the conversation using a bright, manufactured, sisterly tone. She reached across the cold marble surface, attempting to grab my hand in a display of false intimacy. I pulled my arm back immediately, folding my hands securely in my lap. Realizing her faux warmth was failing to penetrate my armor, she quickly pivoted to her secondary strategy. She began weaving an elaborate, highly defensive narrative. She blamed her horrific, narcissistic behavior on the crushing, unrelenting stress of becoming a female entrepreneur. She talked in frantic, breathless circles about the immense pressure of brand building. She delivered a painfully rehearsed, pseudo-feminist speech about how women are forced to fiercely compete and tear each other down in this modern society. She tried to frame her calculated betrayal as a tragic, unavoidable side effect of her sheer ambition and the crushing weight of the corporate patriarchy. I let her talk for exactly 5 minutes. I watched her spin her web of excuses without interrupting her once. Then, I reached into my structured leather tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of printed papers. I had taken the digital screenshots Tessa had provided, the undeniable, time-stamped evidence of my sister's cruelty from the family group chat, and printed them in vivid color. I placed the stack directly on top of her untouched iced latte. I watched every single drop of color drain completely from her face as she looked down at her own venomous words. She stared at the exact messages where she mocked my rustic wedding venue, called my plans pathetic, and bluntly declared that I was merely accustomed to standing firmly behind her anyway. She physically recoiled from the table. She began stammering through a pathetic, disjointed attempt to spin the text thread as a massive misunderstanding, claiming her words were taken completely out of context, but she could not maintain the lie. The physical evidence was simply too absolute. Cornered, stripped of her elegant facade, she instantly abandoned the sisterly act and dropped her absolute truth onto the table. Her voice lowered into a desperate, frantic hiss. She completely ignored the pain she had caused me and pleaded with me to ask Lucas to arrange a high-level emergency introduction for Owen with the executive board of Vale Aurelia. At that exact moment, Lucas walked into the cafe. He had timed his arrival perfectly, catching the tail end of her desperate, greedy request. He pulled up a chair beside me, his presence a massive, solid wall of quiet authority. He completely ignored Vanessa's panicked, wide-eyed expression. He did not offer a polite corporate evasion or a gentle letdown. He looked directly at her and dismantled her delusion with cold, surgical precision. He stated, in a voice entirely devoid of emotion, that his new conglomerate maintained a brutally strict, unforgiving vetting protocol for all prospective vendors and partners. He made it absolutely clear, enunciating every single syllable, that he would never, under any circumstances, risk his professional reputation or utilize his corporate leverage to artificially prop up a family relationship that was fundamentally rotten from its very core. Just as Vanessa opened her mouth, her face flushed red with anger, preparing to argue back. Her phone rang loudly against the marble table. The caller identification displayed Owen's name. In her panicked, highly agitated state, her manicured fingers fumbled with the glass screen. Instead of answering the call normally, she accidentally activated the speakerphone function. Owen's voice echoed loudly and sharply across our small corner of the quiet cafe. He was absolutely furious, completely unhinged by the mounting, crushing pressure of his rapidly collapsing empire. He was screaming into the receiver about a massive unpaid supply chain invoice, and then, completely unaware that he had an audience, he delivered the final, fatal blow to Vanessa's fragile, manufactured ego. He shouted, his voice cracking with rage, that the only reason he had agreed to fund her pathetic, useless launch party in the first place was because they desperately needed enough family members standing in those promotional photographs to trick the outside investors into believing her non-existent brand actually possessed some real social gravity. The silence that fell over our table was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. Vanessa sat frozen in her expensive chair, utterly destroyed by her own husband's brutal, unfiltered confession. The glittering, incredibly expensive illusion she had sacrificed my entire wedding to protect had just been ruthlessly exposed as a cheap, desperate stage play. There was no prestigious brand. There was no deep, unshakable marital loyalty. There was only a terrifying, empty void of mounting debt, mutual resentment, and desperate lies. I slowly stood up from the table. I did not feel an ounce of vindication or joy. I did not want to scream at her or demand a groveling apology. I only felt a profound, deep-settling exhaustion in my bones. I looked down at my older sister, a woman who had spent 35 years actively ensuring I remained a small, unremarkable shadow in her blinding spotlight. I laid out the final, unmovable boundary of my existence. I told her, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth, that there would be no financial bailout from us. There would be no corporate introductions made on their behalf. There would be absolutely zero effort on my part to help save their crumbling public image or prevent their impending bankruptcy. I stated clearly that if any member of my bloodline ever wanted to occupy even a fraction of a space in my life again, they would have to earn that right by walking through the door with unvarnished truth, genuine accountability, and a profound respect for my autonomy. They could no longer buy their way in, manipulate their way in, or use their financial desperation as a master key to my life. I picked up my bag, turned my back on her trembling form, walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight with my husband holding my hand, and left them all to drown in the shallow, ugly waters they had so eagerly jumped into. Exactly 90 days after that disastrous encounter in the coffee shop, the final, undeniable reality of my family's financial collapse arrived directly at their front doorstep. The bank was officially moving forward with the foreclosure proceedings. The sprawling suburban house that my mother had worshipped for decades, the physical monument to her carefully manufactured social status, was rapidly slipping through her fingers. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, my father called my cell phone. He did not ask for a loan this time. He did not pitch a miraculous business venture. He simply asked for a quiet, family-only dinner at the house I grew up in. I agreed to go. I did not agree because I harbored a sudden, foolish desire to rescue them from the wreckage they had created. I agreed because I needed to walk through those heavy front doors one last time to officially and permanently close an entire era of my life. Lucas drove me. When we pulled into the familiar driveway, the manicured lawn already looked slightly overgrown and neglected. The facade was beginning to crumble. We stepped inside, and the air in the house felt incredibly heavy, suffocating, and remarkably still. The dining room table was set with my mother's finest china, a pathetic, clinging attempt to maintain the illusion of control in a kingdom that was actively burning to the ground. Vanessa was already there, sitting rigidly in her chair, unaccompanied by Owen. The silence as we took our seats was thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the final hours of their fabricated empire. Vanessa was the very first person to attempt a maneuver. She leaned forward over the polished wood, employing a soft, delicate tone that felt entirely alien and wrong coming from her mouth. She started talking in sweeping, vague terms about family unity, blood bonds, and the unpredictable hardships of the modern economy. Very quickly, however, her velvet approach wore completely thin, exposing the sharp, jagged hook hidden just beneath the surface. She looked at Lucas, then at me, and smoothly suggested that since we were both currently in a highly capable financial position following the corporate buyout, it was our moral obligation to step up and help the family navigate through this temporary, unfortunate phase. She actually used the word capable, weaponizing my husband's success to fund her survival. Before I could even formulate a cold, surgical rejection, a sharp, sudden noise shattered the tension in the room. It was my father. He had slammed his heavy crystal water glass down onto the wooden table with such incredible force that the ice cubes inside cracked loudly against the rim. The sound echoed like shattering glass in the quiet dining room. He held up a shaking hand, completely cutting off his eldest daughter mid-sentence. He looked exhausted, older than I had ever seen him, stripped entirely of his booming artificial confidence. He was a man completely hollowed out by the consequences of his own lifelong cowardice. He turned his gaze directly to me. For the very first time in my entire 31 years of existence, he did not try to smooth over the rough edges, pivot the blame, or invent a polite excuse to protect his image. He simply confessed. He told me, his voice cracking with a terrifying, raw honesty, that he did not miss my wedding because of a complicated scheduling conflict or a desire to keep the peace. He missed the only wedding of his youngest daughter because he was absolutely terrified. He admitted that he had become completely addicted to the luxurious, effortless life that Vanessa and Owen had constructed for him. He was paralyzed by the suffocating fear that if he did not show up to play his assigned role as the smiling patriarch at that fake rooftop launch, Owen would instantly cut off the financial pipeline that was keeping his own household afloat. He traded his daughter's most sacred milestone for a desperate, pathetic grasp at a lifestyle he could not actually afford. The dining room fell into a dead, absolute silence. My mother stared blankly at her empty porcelain plate, completely out of evasive maneuvers, physically shrinking into her chair as the ugly truth hung in the air. She had nowhere left to hide. I absorbed my father's brutal admission. It did not make me cry. It merely solidified the cold, protective layer of concrete around my heart. I then turned my attention to the woman sitting directly across from me. I looked straight into Vanessa's eyes and asked her the one singular question that had lingered in my mind since the exact moment I saw her digital invitation. I asked her point blank if she had intentionally scheduled her fake brand launch on the exact day of my wedding. For a few agonizing minutes, she tried to resist the corner I had backed her into. She shifted uncomfortably in her expensive seat, her eyes darting frantically toward our parents for a backup defense that was never coming. She tried to deploy her usual aggressive anger, attempting to call me paranoid, but she had absolutely no leverage left to stand on. Finally, under the crushing, undeniable weight of the silent room, the polished veneer cracked completely open. She leaned over the table, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated resentment, and she told me the absolute truth. She confessed that she simply could not stomach the idea of me having a single day that belonged entirely to me. For our entire lives, she was the undisputed star, and I was the designated, quiet shadow. The mere thought of me standing in the center of a beautiful room, completely happy, successful, and radiant, without serving as the dull background scenery for her own shining moment, drove her absolutely insane. She scheduled her corporate event specifically to ensure my light would be aggressively extinguished before it could even begin to shine. She wanted to prove that she still controlled the gravity of the family. That confession was the ultimate, staggering climax of the entire narrative. A profound, overwhelming sense of relief washed over my entire body. I no longer had to question my own sanity. I no longer had to lie awake wondering if I was being overly sensitive, demanding, or ungrateful. The invisible, suffocating weight of emotional neglect I had carried for over 3 decades finally had a concrete shape, a definitive name, and a verbalized admission. The ghost haunting my childhood was finally real, and because it was real, I could finally kill it. I looked around the table at the 3 people who shared my DNA. I delivered my final verdict with the detached, clinical precision of a senior contract auditor terminating a toxic vendor agreement. I stated, clearly and firmly, that I would not spend a single cent of our money to save Owen's collapsing restaurant business. I would absolutely not permit Lucas to be used as a corporate bridge to salvage their ruined professional reputations. I refused to fund the toxic, superficial lifestyle that had systematically crushed my spirit for years. However, I offered one singular sterile act of humanity. I told my parents that I would pay the direct costs of a professional moving company, and I would sign a 6-month lease on a modest, practical condominium so they would not be left homeless on the street. But this financial parachute came with an ironclad, non-negotiable condition. They were to immediately and permanently cease all financial and emotional sponsorship of Vanessa's delusions. They were cut off from the country club, the luxury cars, and the endless bailouts. If they handed my sister a single dollar of my money, the lease would be terminated the very next morning, and they would be entirely on their own. I did not wait for their tearful gratitude, their apologies, or their dramatic protests. I stood up from the heavy oak table, leaving my dinner entirely untouched. I reached out, and Lucas took my hand. His grip was warm, solid, and completely unshakable. We walked out of the dining room, down the long hallway, and stepped out the front door into the cool evening air. There was no screaming, no throwing of plates, no loud, chaotic vengeance. True victory does not require a noisy audience or a theatrical collapse. It only requires the absolute certainty of your own self-respect. The story does not end with the destruction of my childhood home. It ends 3 days later. On a quiet Sunday evening, Lucas and I were hosting a dinner in our own home. The dining table was filled with genuine laughter, the rich smell of roasted vegetables, and the light clinking of wine glasses. Surrounding us were the exact 11 people who had sat in those wooden chairs at the Orchard Inn. I looked around the room, feeling a profound, deep-seated peace settling permanently into my bones. It was in that exact moment I finally understood the truth. The real honeymoon was not the luxurious stone balcony overlooking the pristine waters of Lake Como. The real honeymoon, the actual beginning of my beautiful life, was the exact second I stopped begging the wrong people to choose me and simply decided to walk away. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to hear from all of you. So please leave a comment down below, letting me know where in the world you are listening from, so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by even more people.